Today we've got Bex Smith here with me chatting on the Done Deal podcast. Bex is a global executive director at Copa 90, consultant, co-founder of Jama Sports Productions, all-round amazing athlete, holder of numerous degrees, won the treble with Wolfsburg, has travelled and been a player in loads of different countries, played in World Cups, been involved with FIFA, holds numerous degrees. Literally, when I was doing this, Bex, I'm sorry for bigging you up already. I was like, "Whoa, this is amazing." So, thank you firstly for joining me. You're definitely in a much better position on the park than I am when I'm in my office. So,
yeah, this one's a bit jealous.
oh,
She wants to get involved.
amazing.
Yeah.
So we won't take you too long because obviously that one was going to have to want to walk at some point. So,
oh, good. It's so nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure. And it feels weird because you're usually the one asking questions, being the slick person, like the front of media, and here I am, the sort of pretender lawyer trying to ask you a few questions on stuff. But I'll do my absolute best to not sound ridiculously stupid.
Nah.
So, Bex, just a few background things before we get on to some of the amazing stuff you've done more recently, which is you've had even if your career stopped at the point where you were an athlete and did nothing more for your life, you'd have had an amazing career journey as it's been already. Brought up in the US, obviously being a New Zealander as well. How did you decide, or how did you fall into the fact that you were going to be a professional athlete? And then how did you decide to effectively expand your horizons by going and experiencing different cultures and lifestyles?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan, because actually I never really wanted to be a pro footballer. It wasn't something that I aspired to be when I was about 5 years old, like so many other young boys and girls do. But I think I fell into it because I just really enjoyed the qualities and the characteristics that were in it. So I loved, being social. I loved being in a team. I loved the communication. I loved that you really had to work hard. I think football is a very, it's a strenuous sport, as we all know. Now when you try to play in the park at whatever age we all are. Yeah, and I think it just opened different doors and opportunities, and I kind of just kept following the things that I was passionate about. So like you said, travel, culture, learning different languages, seeing things from different perspectives, I think has always been important because my parents are from New Zealand and my sister and I were born in LA, but we grew up in both countries. We've always sort of had quite a multifaceted approach to looking at life, and I think football allowed me to continue to do that. So yeah, had a fun time.
And as then you grew up, and then you realized that football was going to be for you, what were the type of sacrifices that you had to face, in a way, endure to become a professional? Well, it wasn't professional footballer, I guess, at that point, but more or less a footballer with doing various things on the side, including earning degrees in various things in economics and Spanish degrees. Is that right?
Yeah.
Just in case you didn't have enough to do. How did you then decide that you were gonna? Well, firstly, I'll talk about one thing.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear about your experiences on the sporting side, and then how you then, just for example, at Wolfsburg when you won you won the Champions League with Wolfsburg.
Yeah.
And the triple, actually, if I remember, if I'm reading right. And then from 2013 onwards or so, when unfortunately you had to retire, that transition, and just hearing about your sporting success, and then realizing one day you've got to actually transition into another type of profession.
Yeah, that is such a good point, Dan. That's something actually that I'm working on with different people right now, especially with some players, is preparing yourself during your career to be able to transition into that post-football career, or what he'd call the second half of kind of your life and your career. And I think that was something that was always on my radar, even when I was playing. I mean, I was lucky because I was quite passionate about a lot of different things. It was never just football. I never just identified as a footballer. And I think that for me was very important, that my identity was not tied just to that. But then also like got an education, did my MBA, and did my postgrad in psychology because I just really enjoyed it. I love learning about business. I really found like the business of sport was super interesting. And a lot of the areas in sport that I was seeing, you know, coming from a player perspective, I could see that actually it could be improved so much that if you took the more business lens and put it over sport, that actually there's not a lot of business minded or business backgrounded people in the sport that I came from, which was, you know, women's football, but also football, I think, and in general. So it just felt like it was super interesting to learn about those kinds of things. But yeah, for me, so that was why the education was so important. And then working part-time as well. I mean, like you said, I was a professional. I had a chance to be fully professional if I wanted to, but I just never did. I just kind of always wanted to continue things outside of sports. And I think that's really important. And now looking at players that are more and more specialized and more professional. And actually in some instances, like at Lyon, they're not allowed to work or to study outside of football. And I'm not 100% convinced that that's the right way to go, because I think once you're done with the football career, and it is inevitable, and it's actually inevitable, and it happens quite young. And once that happens, you know, you don't really have a lot to fall back on unless you can go into media, or there's very few sort of businesses or jobs that you can do at that point. So I'm rambling a little because this one is distracting me massively with the kids.
You're a much better multitasker, than I could possibly be, that's for sure.
The post-career transition is so important, and if you're not preparing during your career for that transition, then you're going to be far behind, and it becomes a mental health issue.
And almost, it leads quite nicely in to my point, because then what happens as a result of, you know, your retirement is then you I say find your way. You find your next step along your career path, which is at FIFA. How did that actually occur? And then at what point did you realize this could actually be something long-term that you believe that you can do, add value to others, and actually, you know, really feel that you can contribute?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I was playing football, I wasn't even really sure if I wanted to go into the business of football afterwards. But I think just, you know, as you come through, you see so much and you have that experience. So you build up lots of experience that you don't even realize that you have. Sort of, okay, if I wanted to market myself as a player or my team as a player, I would know exactly how to do it. And then you see others who are doing marketing or storytelling or media from outside in, and it just felt like actually there's a big opportunity there because you know it so innately. So I think it was a lot about just sort of got the tail in the face. I think networking was one that I've always sort of done as a player or sort of throughout my career. And it wasn't because it was something that, you know, I went on a course and it's networking, and I wouldn't even really necessarily call it that. It was just I find lots of different people interesting. So like you said in the beginning, asking lots of questions, figuring out what other people do, trying to figure out kind of what you want to do. And I think one of the ways you can do that is by asking other people sort of how they live their lives. And so that's how I met Tatiana Henny, who was running the Women's World Cups at the time when they were doing an inspection visit in Wolfsburg for the 2011 World Cup. This was right when I moved to Wolfsburg. And one of my ex-teammates, oh, hi. Sorry, Dan. Let's get a mini break. Yeah. One of my ex-teammates, Renate Lingor, who actually was one of the best players in the world when she was playing, fantastic midfielder at FFC Frankfurt. And for Germany, she won 2 World Cups, I think. She was working for the DFB at the time, and she wanted to introduce me to Tatiana, just knowing my background and my interests. And so I met Tatiana then, and I think when I was looking to transition from Wolfsburg, she kind of heard that I was looking for something new and kind of recruited me to apply. And so I got a little bit lucky with the timing and the people, but yeah, I was also in a good place, and I had positioned myself to be able to walk through that door once that opportunity sort of opened. We've got some friends too. We've got some podcast guests.
Wow.
So you've got some podcast guests. Right. Back to business.
This is like so new content. I'm gonna I think the new thing you should have on your LinkedIn profile is master multitasker.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've talked to quite a lot of people about is one of my big phrases is luck is where preparation meets opportunity. It's almost like the bit where everybody sees whatever, you can couch luck in loads of different ways. But it seems like one of the things that you've done absolutely purposely and through a lot of process is be like, right, build my network, think about stuff more generally, but also not be one dimensional and, study languages, do degree courses, keep developing. So you're developing your network alongside your knowledge base in order then to advance your career in lots of ways. I guess that was the intentional plan. And you fast forward then to a few years time, and you've got I'd just be fascinated to hear how something like you covering the 2019 World Cup, just by way of then you've come on a few years from 13, you spent quite a lot of time at FIFA, you're at Copa 90, and then you're more or less, I hate the distinction of like saying women's football rather than men's football, but there's no doubt that what happened in my mind in some ways in the public consciousness for 2019 was, it was almost like a breakthrough time where women's football, i.e. the 2019 tournament, became very mainstream for people to talk about. I talked about it constantly, as I would do anyway, but my friends and people around me were like, did you watch the game last night? It wasn't, did you see the game? It was, this is football now. This is sort of football. As a wider point, but also as 2019 sort of came along, even before or afterwards. Did you sense something which just became a football conversation rather than a men's versus women's conversation?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I hear that a lot living here in London, in the UK, but I kind of grew up with that. So in some ways, I feel like people saying that here, it's great to hear, but it also feels a bit strange for me because it's kind of just how it is. It's kind of normal, and my first experience with women's football really was 1999 with the 99ers, which is now going to be made into a Netflix movie, which I can't wait. And then, so I was in the Rose Bowl, and there were 92,000 people for that final. And it was like over 100 degrees. It was stinking hot. It was like terrible conditions for football. And there were 92,000 fans cheering, and it just kind of swept the whole nation. And it was just football, and it always just has kind of been football, or soccer actually. And in America, soccer is, arguably more a female sport, or a sport where more women can reach the elite level than some other sports. So I think it's cool that the World Cup was so popular. And I think having it in this time zone, in the European time zone, was a big difference, because when we organized the 2015 World Cup in Canada, a lot of people said the same thing in that time zone. So a lot of Canadians and Americans all said, this is it. This is the watershed moment for football. And I think it was in that sort of time zone. And in the Americas, it was very much a watershed moment for that sort of section of the planet. And now Europe is kind of 4 years on, and because it was so centralized here. And also the French Federation was incredible. From the very beginning, from the outset of that tournament, even with their bid book, when we first read it in, I don't know when that was, 2014, I think, at the end of, they said, we want this to be the best World Cup that we've ever hosted. Not a men's World Cup, not a women's World Cup, just the World Cup. And we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to give the resources. And it was, a massive priority for the president of the federation. And that fed all the way through their entire federation. And there was a lot of discussions where a lot of times, the French Federation was pushing FIFA to invest more, to do more, to give it more resources. And I think it takes something like that as well. It takes really a federation or the host to take things seriously. And then, a top federation in the world to go, yeah, no, this is it. We're doing this. We're putting our stamp down. And then that's when other people follow. So yeah, it was definitely a really cool moment. It was a lot of fun. I was in France for a month, and we were there with the Copa 90 clubhouses, and we had really cool events, so many interesting people coming through the doors, lots of sort of different types of events that touched into different genres, like sports, that obviously, but then music and fashion. And we had a podcast that we were doing. We had players in, we had photography and art. And so it was just really cool. We had Pele's daughter, Kelly Nascimento, came over and did a talk for us that was previewing her movie. We had a film festival. So it's just, trying to get more fans into football through different doors as well. And I think the women's game can offer that because it's a new landscape. So there were more opportunities to be able to do that. Whereas, you know, the men's is already sort of predetermined how it's going to go. Well, now it's all changing, as you probably know better than I am. But yeah, super interesting moment, I think. Unfortunately, I think after post World Cup, it's fallen off a lot. A lot of the platforms, a lot of the brands, a lot of those who jumped on the Women's World Cup and women's football and that opportunity, which is great, and they should, and that's amazing, have really stopped the investment afterwards. And that's disappointing, to be honest. You know, the media platforms that aren't covering it as much, the media, traditional media, the brands, we haven't really seen that much investment off the back of the World Cup. As much as I would have expected. And I think there's a missed opportunity there for them.
And I guess you get to see it front and center because we're all football fans in the end. And I don't even want to really talk about just women's football in isolation, just like I don't really want to talk about men's football in isolation generally. It's football in my mind. Is that because I know you work a lot brand side and brand related matters as well. Is that a brand education piece? Is that a talent activation piece? Is it a rights holder and league piece? Obviously, it's all together and everything.
Yeah.
If you could put your finger on a few areas generally as to where progress is stifled a little bit and how you think it can be started again. We're talking in COVID-19 times now, generally, where we're talking about brands spending significantly less amounts of money generally. But where's your view on maybe some of those points?
I think it's probably twofold more than anything. I mean, you mentioned lots of different topics, and it's the whole ecosystem, isn't it? But I think the reason why when I left FIFA, I kind of was looking at what part, do I want to stay in football? Do I want to stay in sports? Do I want to stay in women's football? And one of the areas where I saw a massive opportunity was in the lack of good storytelling and the brand of women's football, because any kind of type of media, whether if it was written or video content or even the games and the highlights, how they're packaged, I didn't like the brand. It didn't feel like that fit to me and what I'd seen, and the players, the cool stories, and the passion and the just really brilliant quality football that was being played. So I really felt like actually women's football needed a rebranding, which is why, you know, we started JAMA Productions, which was based off of trying to tell underrepresented stories in media and women's football stories, but in a way cooler way, in a way that felt like the quality could be there as well, because a lot of times in media and in content creation for women's, there's just not a lot of money. So it's a lot of really passionate fans that decide to start their own media platforms or to do some content, and there's just not a lot of funding to make it high quality. And so that was kind of why we started, and that's how I ended up getting involved with Copa 92, which is obviously an incredible content creation and creative platform, but also works with some of the top brands in the world. So it just felt like that was where there's an opportunity, and that's where I think that, you know, especially during this time in COVID, there's just such a lack of creativity in the women's space and lack of brands really buying into it. I think what we're seeing now is that players are taking it upon themselves to do it. So where there's been massive opportunities and where players have slid right into it is with the players themselves. So on their platforms or using them, you know, to talk about matches or to do training videos, things like that. But a lot of times it's not really sponsored, or it's through the federation, you know, like the FA. So I think it's twofold. It's the media and the lack of media, lack of storytelling, which leads to a lack of visibility, which means that there's a lack of education on women's football, which makes it really hard for brands to understand the sport, which makes it hard for them to invest. So I think one of my jobs at Copa, and just more generally, I think for the sport, is to try to help educate brands on why it's such an opportunity and why there's a massive gap that they can help fill, and actually you get more bang for your buck in the women's game, you know, for much less investment. I mean, Visa made an investment over 7 years with UEFA. The first women's football investment is 10 million over 7 years. I mean, that's nothing for a brand like that. When you look at what they invest in the Olympics and other sports, in the men's, for FIFA, for example, for the Men's World Cup. And the amount of return they're getting on it, return on investment, but also return on experience and brand sentiment is massive. So it's a lot of education, I think, with brands, and it's not because, you know, they're not intelligent, they're not bright, they don't have the statistics. It's that there's no visibility, so they wouldn't even know, you know, what players or why are they cool or why are they interesting, why should we have them as ambassadors for our brand, because they never see them. They don't see them on linear TV, they don't see them on digital campaigns. So I think those two things have to go hand in hand to really sort of ignite the next phase in the women's game.
And for example, on the club side, obviously we're seeing in some ways a more holistic approach to men's and women's teams. If it's activations, if it's particular brand associations just with women, if it's, for example, you know, kit activation with everyone in, like if it's Pep and Jill Scott and De Bruyne or whatever it is at City and whatever else it might be. And huge attendances, obviously, at particular games, especially in Spain, and obviously with the WSL last year. Well, last year, yeah, middle of last season, anyway. Do you think what impact effect does COVID have? Obviously, we've got the curtailing of the WSL, at least in the UK as well. With obviously reduced funding, sponsorship, other opportunities that happen as a result, does this, in a grander scheme, obviously this has issues for football, does it have a disproportionately negative impact for women's as a result?
Great question. I do think it has a detrimental effect on the women's game, but I'm not going to say it's more. So I don't think it's more than on the men's game. I think when you look at what are we talking about when we say detrimental, because there's the commercial side. So when you look at the whole ecosystem of football, we look at the quality of the sport, we look at the players and their injury rates or their health and safety, really. We look at broadcasters, we look at brands. So when you look at the commercial side of things, I think both men's and women's football have taken a massive hit during COVID-19 times because it can't be broadcast. One of the main reasons is because it can't be broadcast, and a lot is tied to sort of the visibility of it. But I also think that there's massive opportunities during this time, which I actually feel like the women's side can take more advantage of during this time, because it's never been on linear TV, so that didn't have to take that hit. It's never had really massive, huge sponsors that are supporting it, so that's really not something. Like the commercial side is not really an issue, but the quality of the sport, I think, needs to be retained because it's still in an infancy stage. And I always said at Copa, you never have a second chance to make a first impression. And a lot of people have never seen women's football because it's never been on TV. I mean, before the World Cup last summer, obviously, which means that if we're going to show it for the first time, if you're ever going to see it for the first time, then it has to be the highest quality possible. And I think bringing the WSL back after having over 2 months of players working out in their homes, not being able to train as a team, and then to try to bring them back into playing a league format, and like the Premier League coming back in on the 17th, which is a great day. It's my birthday. On a Wednesday, Wednesday weekend, Wednesday sort of the English weeks, there's going to be issues with injuries. And Zone 7 did a really great study on that specifically after the first weekend of the Bundesliga, and can kind of prove with data and statistics that there will be higher injury rates. So what does that mean about the quality of those matches that we're seeing? What does that mean about the health of those players? Not just this season, but what does that have as an impact of the quality of football moving forward? And I think on the women's side, the WSL ending was the right decision, because they don't have enough support. They don't have enough support to have the proper testing. They don't have the right support on their medical side. Most of the clubs, even the top clubs in most of the countries around the world, and there's not a reason like a commercial pressure either. So I think it was the right decision on the women's. On the men's, I mean, commercially, it would be really hard to not have continued on the men's side. There would have been a lot more money lost. It would have had a massive economic impact on the men's side, but you know, at what risk? At what's the cost to players now? So it's not an easy decision to make, but certainly on the women's, I think it was the right one.
And if I can just ask you then a couple of
I didn't even answer your question. You were asking about, detrimental.
Yeah.
Did I even answer your question there?
You definitely did. I'm just happy someone's, you know, I'm able to chat to someone. It's literally everyone in my family, and outside of that, it's just great. It's great to see a familiar face.
Yeah.
Just like one or two last things. I think the first is that, you know, obviously one of the things that you're doing is it feels like a lot of the stuff that you do is pretty holistic. I would class you as a sort of thought leader where you're talking about loads of different, really interesting, interconnected things, which I'm sure is almost what you've been doing at Copa, been doing at JAMA, been doing at FIFA, as an athlete, as someone that's got a master's in psychology, etc. as well, is that almost what you're doing is putting all of these pieces together and offering views based on all of your experiences and combined knowledge. You know, I presume that is the type of stuff that you'd like to then get involved with going forward, and probably are doing in any event right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed it right on the head. That's the part about sports that I love the most, is that actually there's not just one element to it that I like. It's taking a step back and looking at it from a holistic perspective. And I think when you do that, that's when you can really start to grow the game and make major shifts in the development and growth of the game in different parts of it. But they all kind of have to work together and come together. So certainly when people ask, you know, is women's football exploding? You know, what's the next phase in the growth of the women's game? There's not one thing you can put your finger on, but depending on who you ask, it really depends on where their expertise is. And that's what they're going to tell you, sort of how to grow the game. And that's great, because they're probably right, all of them. But unless all of those things are working together, well, I would say when those things are working together in the best way, in an optimum way, that's when you really get the synergies to be able to move things and shift things. So yeah, I'm working on some really interesting projects now with different people, with different types of groups and entities and businesses and players during this time. And I think that's always what I've liked to do, is sort of have knowledge and keep a pulse on every part of the sport and what's going on, so that they can all be pulled together and be able to help the other parts of it as well. So yeah, enjoying this time somehow, weirdly.
The last question we usually ask all of our guests is to give some type of recommendations to something that you're either reading, consuming, have watched. And I know, Bex, I'm putting you on the spot here because I didn't actually ask you this question beforehand. So, for example, I've been reading a great book called Surrounded by Idiots, and that's nothing to do with my team at Sheridan's whatsoever. It's more the opposite, which is talking about different personality types, etc., and how people fit into particular categories, etc. And I've been watching The Last Dance, obviously the Michael Jordan documentary, which I've sort of loved, and the Test, which is on Amazon, which has been following sort of the Aussie team post ball tampering up until winning the Ashes in the UK as well, which is cool. So it was really, I was just keen on hearing, you know, what others, you know, high profile people that are in the sports space are sort of watching and doing and reading as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You know, to be really honest, content for me, I'm very particular with. I'm not the kind of person that will scroll through and watch a lot of different, I mean, I sort of get a little taste of everything, but to keep my attention on something, especially video, takes quite a lot. So that's a really good question. My favorite book right now that I'm reading is called Originals. It's just brilliant. It's kind of that type of book that pulls in lots of different areas and examples from different industries and genres of business and life, really, and talks about how it's always the nonconformists that are shifting things forward. And so it just kind of like speaks to me very much, right up my alley. So I love that book. Pippa Grange, who works for Right to Dream, incredible woman, has just written a book, How to Win at Life Without Losing Yourself. So I'd be keen to read that, because I think she has a really unique perspective as well, and has come from different areas of sport, and now working with Right to Dream in Denmark, in the club there. And she's just a really interesting, sort of inspiring woman. So those are 2 books. I also got Sapiens.
Yeah.
So I've been dying to read this book.
Oh gosh, I read it a while back. Yeah.
Really? Yeah. You like open it, in the first 2 pages, I'm like, this is gonna blow my mind. So I'm kind of waiting until I feel that some of my other projects have died down a bit, so I can spend more, like put more brain juice into it. Yeah. I haven't watched The Last Dance because I'm saving it. I don't know why. It's one of those things where Michael Jordan was like my idol growing up. I absolutely just thought I could be him. Don't even know where to go with that comment. But I loved him. So it's kind of one of those things where I know I'm going to get like super emotional. I'm going to cry. So I'm waiting for the right moment to watch that too. Gangs of London. Gangs of London I just started, which is quite random because I'm not a gangster like film series type person, but I really like the actor. He was in this other series called Pure, which is just a fun sort of like, a story about a girl who moves to London. And he was in it, and I just really liked him in that series. And now he's like the head gangster's son in this series, and I just like him as an actor. But it's intense, and also I love it because it's filmed a lot in East London, which is where I live, or more like Spitalfields and that's a whole area. So I just think it's cool to see that kind of thing. Like I'm literally like right one street next to me, there's this really cool like secret bar type place, and it was in the show, and I'm like, oh, there's that bar, So I thought that was cool because I always kind of like have to pinch myself that I'm living in London, because I think it's cool. It's such a great city. So I'm really enjoying sort of those series that are filmed in and around London. That's about it for now. Like
I was about to say, literally, that's the most comprehensive list. And like literally, people will just go maybe a book or something. You've given them like 6 months worth of reading and watching it. It's brilliant.
I did warn you though. I was like, this could be a really long podcast. I can talk about like all kinds of random shit for days. So that might be why I watch and read a lot of random stuff. Yeah.
That's amazing. Well, look, I don't want to keep you too much longer. I want you to enjoy your walk and enjoy your day. Thanks so much for chatting. It's been great, and look forward to seeing you again, maybe in the flesh sooner rather than later.
I hope so, Dan. And I keep putting out all your stuff because I love it. It's so good, and it's such an interesting sort of perspective on sports, and all the legal things that are happening now with COVID. I think that I always really enjoy reading your stuff and listening to your things. So thanks so much for keeping that out in the public and not just keeping it to yourself. I think it's really educational for everyone as well. So, and I'm totally going to hit you up after this and have some chats and pick your brain. So thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. Speak soon.
Okay. Ciao.